This week in Genesis, continuing our study, we were introduced to a new character, Abraham. He was the oldest of three boys of their father Terah. They lived up in northern Mesopotamia in a city called Haran. The entire area was inhabited by the Chaldeans, and that was Abraham's ancestors. At the end of chapter 11, we're given an interesting point that would have been something that defined Abraham and his wife Sarah's existence. You see, as the firstborn, what Abraham looked forward to was the fact that he would have the firstborn's right to inheritance, that he would inherit land, that his children would make a name, to continue the family name on, and that whatever hope he had in that land, and they were herdsmen by trade, could expand and so on, was all placed upon him as the firstborn. And he would take care of his younger brothers and the subsequent families and so on. All these great hopes of anyone in his position in an ancient Near Eastern family. But the information we're given right there in the end of chapter 11 is this, that Abram and Sarah were barren. They couldn't have children. All of those hopes that they would have had, all of those expectations as the firstborn and what they would have anticipated coming together in marriage and hoping for their children is now deferred. And many years would pass and them trying to have children, and it would not come to pass. And this would have been a very low point for Abram and Sarah and the hopes that they would have had for their future. And yet it's in this moment that God speaks to Abram. God says to Abram, what I want you to do is leave your father's household, leave your family, leave this land, and go to a land that I will show you, a land that I'm going to give you, and I'm going to make your name great. I'm going to make you into a nation. Hence, you're going to have kids, and I will bless you. A promise of the Almighty Creator God to a man and a woman whose hope had been dashed. And all they would have to do to receive these promises from God is to believe it, to trust Him. And they demonstrated their trust, it says in Genesis chapter 12 and verse 4, by doing exactly what God had asked him. He left his father's household. He moved out of that northern area in Mesopotamia and he entered into the land of Canaan, the land that God would give him. And he trusted God. How are we trusting God in those moments where we are at our lowest, that we're experiencing hope deferred or difficulty or pain, or sometimes the very exciting future that we'd hoped for now has been altered due to circumstances that were entirely beyond our ability to control? Do we trust God to be good? Do we trust God to never leave us or forsake us in those times? And do we trust God to be our blessing? Do we trust Him to make our name great? Well, Abraham, in his obedience, would live in that land, hoping for the fulfillment of God's promise of a son for 25 more years. And when Abraham was 99 years old, he was visited once again by God and told that in 1 year's time you will have a son. And Abraham laughed to himself. And in my old age, he was 99, Sarah was 89 years old, I'm going to have a son? So excited about the prospect of God finally fulfilling this promise. And Abraham had been faithful all these years to believe that God could do it. And 1 year later, Genesis chapter 21 tells us that Isaac was born. Abram and Sarah named their son Isaac, which means laughter. Laughter had returned to them. In place of sorrow, now joy was a part of their experience. And this is the promise that God offers us as believers if we trust Him. God says, I can take the fact that you have sinned and are eternally separated from me, and I can remove that because I love you, and I have sent my Son, Jesus, to die on the cross. And His death on the cross pays the penalty for all of mankind's sin. And the only thing that we have to do to inherit this righteousness from God is trust him. Trust that God can do the impossible on our behalf. Believe in God's promise toward us. How are we willing to do that today? How are we willing to do that in the midst of the hopes of our life or the difficulties of our life? God one day will reward all of our faithfulness. One day we will see the fulfillment of our salvation when we see God face to face. But in the meantime, we live out our life. We live out a life of faith. We're facing the highs and the lows and the circumstances of life. Are we doing that while trusting God for that outcome? One day, he'll make good on his promise and we will see him. The reality of our relationship with him will be completely fulfilled in his presence for all of eternity. The rewards that he has promised will be realized. But for now, we have to wait. We have to look for that promise. We have to look for his coming. We have to look for that day that we see him and live by faith, trusting God every step of the way. God hasn't left us. He'll never leave us. He has good intended for us. May we continue to live for him in faith. So if you haven't heard Sunday's message, I just want to direct you to the website because we talk about these passages in detail there, and you can download that message or listen to it online. In the upcoming weeks, I want you to be looking, or this upcoming Sunday, look toward Genesis chapter 22, because we see a very critical time point in Abram's life when he is tested by God, and he's tested through his son Isaac, the son of the promise. So read ahead, Genesis chapter 22, and we'll see you on Sunday at 10:30.